In a world that once thrived on conflict, where the echoes of war drums defined generations, a subtle but unstoppable change began to take root. It wasn't sparked by governments or armies, but by the tired eyes of mothers who had buried sons, the trembling hands of fathers who had returned from distant wars broken beyond repair, and the innocent questions of children who couldn't understand why playgrounds sometimes turned to graveyards. In the shadows of ruined cities and the silence of burned-out villages, humanity started to ask itself a painful but necessary question. What have we really won? As borders expanded and collapsed, as flags rose and fell, it became clear that the price of victory was often higher than its worth. In a small village in Eastern Europe, a soldier named Ilya laid down his rifle, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He had seen too much. The screaming, the fire, the helplessness in the eyes of those he was meant to protect. One night, after burying a comrade whose name he never knew, he looked up at the stars and wondered if his enemies stared at the same sky. On the other side of the world, in a Middle Eastern town, a young girl named Layla, whose school was destroyed in a drone strike, began secretly teaching neighborhood children how to read using scraps of burnt textbooks. She had lost her brother to the same war, but instead of revenge, she chose knowledge. In cities where protests once ended in violence, people began to sit in silence, holding candles instead of weapons. Art replaced anger. Music returned to the streets. Stories were shared between supposed enemies who discovered they liked the same poetry, the same food, the same dreams. The change wasn't sudden. It was painfully slow, often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There were betrayals, setbacks, and moments where peace felt like a foolish fantasy. But over time, humanity remembered its deepest instinct, survival not through domination but through unity. Technology helped too. AI, once built for surveillance and war, was reprogrammed for communication, translation, healing. Drones delivered food instead of bombs. Satellites tracked climate patterns to prevent famines instead of guiding missile paths. A global network of peace hubs emerged, digital and physical spaces where people from conflicting nations could meet, talk, and cry together. There was a woman in Brazil who forgave the man who killed her son in a gang war. Their story went viral and became a symbol of radical forgiveness. In Africa, ex-child soldiers became peace educators, traveling from village to village, teaching others how to unlearn violence. Schools began teaching empathy alongside math. Nations invested more in healthcare than weaponry. Even media shifted. Movies started showing the cost of war in raw, unfiltered detail, making audiences weep, reflect, and reject glorified violence. The old war heroes, once celebrated for their kill counts, started to speak openly about their trauma, their regrets, their desire for future generations to never walk the same path. In one symbolic moment, a former general and his lifelong rival stood on the ruins of a demolished bunker and planted a tree together, its roots burying bullets, its leaves catching the wind of change. Children grew up hearing stories not of conquest but of connection. The word enemy began to lose meaning. Differences were still there, of culture, faith, belief, but they were no longer threats. They were reasons to talk, to learn. This global shift didn't erase pain, but it transformed it. People began honoring their dead not by seeking revenge but by building clinics, libraries, gardens. The soil of former battlefields grew food. The rivers once red with blood now carried clean water to homes. The world didn't become perfect, but it became human again. Peace was no longer an ideal spoken in political speeches. It was lived in the everyday choices of millions. And so, when future generations asked, why did humans choose peace? The answer was never about treaties or leaders. It was about a collective awakening. The realization that while war may sometimes be unavoidable, peace is always a decision, one made not in grand halls, but in quiet hearts, one chosen again and again each day by people who had seen enough of death to finally choose life. Years passed since the world began choosing peace, but the real challenge had only begun: keeping it. In the aftermath of war's silence, humanity faced ghosts that didn't vanish with gunfire. Trauma lingered like smoke after the fire, haunting even the quietest corners of rebuilt cities. Peace, they learned, wasn't the absence of war. It was the presence of understanding, patience, and relentless effort. In a coastal town in Japan, an old war nurse named Aiko opened a healing center, not just for wounds of flesh, but for the deeper ones: memories, nightmares, grief. People came from across the world: soldiers, widows, children born during bombings, each carrying a heavy silence that needed to be heard. Her method was simple: listen, touch, and remind them that they were still human. In South America, a man named Javier, once a drug cartel enforcer, dedicated his life to building music schools for at-risk youth. He used the money he once earned through violence to buy violins, drums, and recording equipment. His students didn't know him as a killer; they knew him as the man who gave them a future. Across Europe, former enemies formed joint cultural festivals where French and German families broke bread together, where art replaced arguments and folktales became bridges between generations. But not everyone welcomed this new peace. There were those who thrived in division, who missed the power they had in chaos. A digital resistance began spreading misinformation, trying to resurrect old hatreds, painting peace as weakness. Bomb threats returned. Small skirmishes flared up at borders. But something had changed. This time, the world didn't take the bait. Instead of escalating, people responded with truth, dialogue, unity. In the heart of Africa, a group of tribal leaders who had once fought over land joined forces to create a neutral zone they called the ground of listening, a sacred place, where no weapons were allowed and every dispute was solved with storytelling and song. In the United States, police departments restructured, trained not just in control but in compassion. Officers were required to spend time in schools, hospitals, and refugee centers to learn empathy before earning their badge. Peace became policy, not just poetry, and as Earth healed, so did its people. Climate cooperation led to cleaner skies. Former war budgets were redirected to science, education, mental health. On a restored island in the Pacific, a conference was held, not by politicians but by youth. Teenagers from war-torn countries shared visions for a world where technology served humanity, not enslaved it. One girl named Amara from Nigeria said, "Peace isn't quiet, it's loud, it sings, it builds, it moves." Her voice sparked a wave of youth movements that pushed leaders to sign what came to be known as the Human Continuity Pact, a global agreement not only to avoid war, but to actively pursue understanding. This pact had no weapons clause, no economic threats, just a shared vow to protect the fragile miracle of connection. And yet, true peace required facing the truth. Truth commissions were formed in every continent. War criminals confessed publicly. Survivors told their stories. A global day of mourning was established, not to shame the past but to remember its cost. On that day, every year, the world fell silent for 5 minutes. No cars moved, no factories ran, no screens lit up. People held hands, stood still, and remembered. A child in India once asked her grandfather during that silence, "Why are we quiet?" And he replied, "So we never forget how loud hate can be." Slowly, peace became culture. Languages mixed. Marriages crossed old enemy lines. Schools taught conflict resolution from kindergarten. A new generation rose, one that didn't inherit enemies, only lessons. This generation built cities designed around inclusion. Parks where no one felt unsafe, community kitchens where no one ate alone. Not everyone believed it would last. The scars of war were deep, but healing had begun, and it was contagious. In prisons, restorative justice replaced punishment. In courts, mediation became the first step. In homes, children were taught to say, "I understand," before "I argue." Peace wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it had become preferable. Powerful, even popular. Documentaries were made, songs were written, VR experiences let people step into each other's lives. Empathy became the new currency. And when a natural disaster struck, a massive earthquake that shook 3 continents, the world didn't fall apart. It came together. Countries that had once bombed each other now sent rescue teams. Soldiers used their training not to fight, but to dig survivors from rubble. It was then, in that moment of shared pain and shared effort, that humanity saw its true face, scarred, yes, but radiant with resolve. From the ashes of centuries, a global family had emerged, not without flaws, not without setbacks, but with a new understanding. Peace was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of one. One still being written by every kind word, every hard conversation, every bridge built where walls once stood. And that is why humans continued to choose peace. Not because it was easy, not because it was perfect, but because after all the bloodshed, they had finally discovered something stronger than fear, hope.